Hey, sixth grade, we're moving on to lesson 5.4, estimating percents of a number. Estimating means to quickly find an answer that is close to, but not exactly, the answer. It helps us determine the correctness of our actual calculations. After we do all the work, we can think back to our estimate and say, does this work make sense, or did I make a silly mistake? It is helpful to round each percent in the problem to the nearest 10. For example, 54% is close. This math symbol here means about. It is close to 50%. 54 is close to 50. Right? Or 31% is close to 30. Yeah, they're only one apart. Or 67% is about 70. So this is rounding. If you're not great at rounding, it's okay. Just think about what easy number is the percent close to. Here's how it's helpful. If you know that 50% is the same as 50 over 100, then you also know that 50% is half. So you could think in your head, if I have to solve 53% of 48, that's really similar to saying 50% of 48, which is half of 48. And I know that half of 48 is 24. That means that 53% of 48 is about 24. It's not going to be exactly, but it's about. Or, here's the next problem. Knowing that 50% is half, 46 is pretty close to 50. So I'm going to change this problem to 50%. Oh, I don't want to find half of an odd number. That's okay. Isn't 81 close to 80? I think so. So this is 50% of 80, which is the same as saying half of 80. And I know that is 40. Therefore, 46% of 81 is going to be close to or about 40. These are estimates. Our next lesson is going to have you find the exact answers. And it's easy to press the wrong buttons in a calculator or do some silly math in our head. But if you think about what the answer should be close to, then we can find those silly mistakes. 50% is a helpful number. Here's another helpful number. It's 10%. We know that if it's 10%, then 100 goes on the bottom, and the 10 becomes the top of the fraction. And if we simplify, 10 over 100 becomes 1/10, because you can divide them both by 10. All right. When we are putting this into our calculator, if I asked you to put that in your calculator, you would say 1 divided by 10. Do you see this divided by 10 part? If you want to find a tenth of a number, you take that number and divide it by 10. So let's try it out. Here's the first problem. It says 12% of 40 is about, right? So I'm going to think, well, 12% is close to 10%. So this is 10% of 40. And if I want to find 10%, then I need to do 40 split into 10. Right? This 10%, it means split into 10. That answer is 4. So 12% of 40 is going to be about 4, because 10% of 40 is 4. We can find 10% by just dividing a number by 10. So here's another example, 9% of 62. 9%, pretty close to 10% of, and then 62, I could find 10% of 62, but I think it's going to be easier to find 10% of 60. Right? So 10% just means take that 60 and divide by 10, and we get 6. So 9% of 62 is going to be close to, but probably not exactly 6. I think finding 10% is pretty easy. Dividing a number by 10, I'm pretty good at doing. It's really helpful to know how to find 10% because you can estimate other percents by just stacking or repeating 10%. So we're going to repeat 10%. If we can find 10%, we can keep plussing them until we get to a different percent. For example, 30% really is just 10 plus 10 plus 10%. So if I can figure out 10%, I can add it 3 times and I'll get 30%. Right? So let's try this out. It says 10% of 80. Well, 10% of 80 just means I take 80 and I split it into 10, and that's 8. Do you see how I use the actual equal sign here? Because I know 10% of 80 is exactly 8. Down below, I have kind of something that looks like a number line. It's called a percent bar. Right? So I can see that there are percents going across the top. So there's 0, 10, 20, 30, keep on going, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and 100. Okay, we just said that 10% of 80 is 8. So I'm going to put 10%, underneath that 10%, I'm going to put 8. Underneath 0%, I'm going to put 0, because 0% means nothing. Now, each one of these little boxes, these little parts, are the same size. I'm going to move this over so you can see it's exactly the same size. So that means each one of these boxes is worth 8. So I'm going to skip count by 8. 8, 16, 24. Here's another 10% right here, so that's another 8. And I'm going to keep on going all the way across. Go 40, 48, 56, 64, 72, and look at what number is at the end. 80. That's the number that we're trying to find a percent of, because all of it is 80. 100% of it, all of it is 80. So we're just trying to find a part of 80. We know that 10% of 80 is 8. So what if I need to find 30%? Well, if I use this bar, I can see that I can keep on going until I get to 30%. But look down here on the bottom. We plussed 8, we plussed 8, and we plussed 8. This red bar is worth 8 every single time. So if I can find 10%, and I know it's 8, then I need 3 8s to find 10%. Sorry, to find 30%. So this problem says 33% of 80 is about. Well, 30% of 80 is 8 plus 8 plus 8. So that equals 24. So 33% of 80 is going to be about 24. You honestly could say a little bit more, because 33% is a little bit more than 30%. Let's try another stacker problem. This time I have 70%. I need to find 72% of 54. Oh, that's a really complicated problem. I'm going to make it a little bit easier and say 70% of, and then I'm going to round 54 and say 50 is close enough. I'm going to find 70% of 50. So that means I'm going to think in my head, well, what is 10% of 50? Well, 10% of 50, 50 divided by 10 equals 5. So I'm going to think in my head, every time I have 10%, I have 5. So let's go over here, and we're going to try this out. 70% means 10% plus 10% plus 10% plus 10%. Oh my goodness. 4 plus 10%. 5 plus 10%, that gets me to 60, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, plus 10 more percent. And the work that we just did said 10% of 50 is 5. So I'm going to go back to these 10% and I'm going to replace them with the number 5. Right, so instead of this 10%, whoops, try that again. Instead of this 10%, let's write 5. And instead of the next 10%, we'll write 5. I think you get the idea. Every time you see 10%, we're going to replace it with 5s. Here's another 2 10%. So that means 5 and 5 more. And then the last 10% is still 5. So I've got all these 5s. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35. Or that's the same as saying 7 times 5 equals 35, because we have 7 repeats of 5. Let's show this on the number line. 10% of 50 is 5. That's what we figured out. So underneath 10%, I'll write 5. So then there's 0. So now you can see that this is a count by 5 pattern. Every one of these boxes, every one of these parts is the same size. So they have to have the same value. Each time I have a box, I have to add 5. So this box here is worth 5, so plus 5. Every box is worth 5. 35, 40, 45, 50. All right. So the problem that we did was 70% of 50. So now I'm just going to color in to 70%. Here's 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%, 70%. Hey, look at what number we got on the bottom. This says 70% is 35. But because this wasn't really 70% of 50, we need to say that it's going to be about 35. Probably not exactly, but close to it. Being able to divide numbers by 10 is a really helpful skill when you are working on percents. So now it's your turn. Please try practice page 5.4.2, and remember, you can find the help video in Schoology in the 5.4.2 assignment if you need help getting started.